What would you do if the person who promised to stand beside you handed you the one thing that could break you, on the very same day you finally chose to believe in yourself? I still remember the sound of that thin stack of papers sliding across the table. It was quieter than a slammed door, but it hurt more. Before I tell you what happened next, hit that like button right now, because this story earns it. Subscribe if you believe people can rebuild themselves from nothing, and share this with someone who once had their dreams laughed at. Trust me, you'll want to see how this ends. My name is Daniel Cole. I was 39 years old, standing in the kitchen of a small rented house in Denver, Colorado, holding a resignation letter I had just turned in that same morning. I had just quit a job that paid me almost $200,000 a year, a job I had held for 15 years, a job that gave me security, comfort, and a slow, quiet kind of misery I had learned to ignore. I worked at Harlow Manufacturing, a large industrial equipment company on the edge of the city. I started as a junior technician, moved into engineering, then into operations management. By the time I left, I was one of the senior directors. Good salary, good benefits, a parking spot with my name painted on it. The kind of job everyone tells you to be grateful for, even when it's slowly hollowing you out. For almost 5 years, after my son Leo went to sleep, after the dishes were done and the house went silent, I sat at our kitchen table with a laptop and a cold cup of coffee, building something of my own. It was a piece of software designed to help small factories detect equipment failures before they happened, using cheap sensors and simple data patterns. Nothing glamorous. Just years of testing, failing, adjusting, and testing again. 3 weeks before that afternoon, a small investment group based in Berlin had reached out. They liked what I built. They offered to fund it properly, enough to hire a real team and test it in factories across Europe. But there was one condition. I had to commit fully. No more nights stolen from sleep, no safety net, no half measures. So, I resigned. I remember driving home that day, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. I even stopped and bought a small cake, because some foolish part of me believed my wife would be proud. Her name was Elena. We had been married for 11 years. When I walked into the kitchen holding that cake, she was already standing there with an envelope in her hand. She didn't say congratulations. She didn't ask how the meeting went. She simply placed the envelope on the table and looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Cold, certain, already decided. I opened it slowly. Divorce papers. You already had these prepared? I asked. Yes, she said, without blinking. Our son Leo was 3 years old at the time, sitting on the kitchen floor, pushing a small toy truck across the tiles, completely unaware that his entire world was about to change. How long have you been planning this? I asked. Long enough, she said. I wasn't going to waste my life waiting to see if you'd fail. Those words landed harder than anything else she could have said. I wasn't angry yet. I was just stunned. The kind of stunned where your body keeps standing but your mind has already left the room. Elena, this isn't some reckless idea, I said. You've seen me work on this for years. You know what it could become. She let out a short, tired laugh. I know exactly what men say when they want their families to gamble on a dream. That's not fair. No, she said, tapping the papers. What's not fair is deciding to throw away a stable life at your age and expecting me to celebrate like you're 25 with nothing to lose. At your age. Those 3 words stayed lodged in my chest for years afterward. I was 39, not old, not finished. But in that single sentence, she made me feel like dreaming had an expiration date, and I had already passed it. I'm not asking you to celebrate, I said quietly. I'm asking you to believe in me. For a brief second, something in her face softened. Just a flicker. Then it vanished. My father said almost the same thing to my mother, she said, right before he lost everything. I knew the story. Her father had once run a small hardware business that collapsed when she was a teenager. Their family had struggled for years afterward. It was a wound she carried quietly, and I understood, in that moment, that she wasn't only afraid of my failure. She was afraid of reliving her childhood. "I am not your father," I said. "No," she replied, "but you sound exactly like him." Leo crashed his toy truck into my shoe and looked up at me, grinning, completely unaware of the storm happening above his head. I forced a smile for him. Elena didn't even glance his way. "I'm done living beside a countdown clock," she said. "Waiting to see when the funding disappears, waiting to see when we lose the house, waiting to see if you turn into someone I don't recognize." "Is there someone else?" I asked, almost without meaning to. She didn't answer directly. She simply looked toward the hallway, and that silence told me everything I needed to know. I won't pretend the next few months were dramatic. They weren't. There were no screaming matches, no thrown plates. Just lawyers, emails, custody schedules, and two people slowly learning how distant they could become while still living under rules written by other people. When the opportunity with the investors became real, they wanted me based near their partner factories overseas, closer to Germany, where the pilot programs were starting. Elena refused to relocate. She had built a new life already forming in Denver, one that clearly didn't include either of us. After weeks of negotiation, she agreed that Leo could live with me abroad, with scheduled calls, holiday visits, and summer stays whenever the company could afford the travel. The mediator called it a workable arrangement. I called it the hardest decision I had ever agreed to. The morning we left, the airport smelled like burnt coffee and rain-soaked coats. Leo wore a small backpack shaped like a dinosaur and held my hand with sticky fingers from the juice box he insisted on finishing before boarding. Elena came to say goodbye, but didn't stay long. She kissed the top of his head, told him to behave for his father, and then looked at me with something between pity and warning. "Don't make him pay for your dream," she said. I swallowed hard. "I won't." She walked away without looking back. Leo tugged at my sleeve. "Is Mommy coming with us?" I crouched down to his level. "Not this time, buddy. But you and me, we're going on an adventure." He looked out at the massive windows, at the planes lined up outside. "Will there be dinosaurs there?" I laughed, because if I hadn't, I might have broken down right there in the terminal. "I bet there will be." He nodded, completely satisfied, the way only small children can trust you before you've proven anything at all. Now, before we continue this story, I want you to do something simple. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching this from. It helps this video reach more people who need to hear stories like this one, and it means more to me than you know. Now, back to Daniel's story. 3 years after landing overseas, I found myself sitting alone in a small rented office at nearly 3 in the morning, staring at a payroll account that had less than 2 weeks of funds remaining. Not 2 months. 2 weeks. The air conditioning unit above my desk rattled weakly. Outside the window, the city glowed with lights from towers filled with people whose lives seemed to be moving forward, while mine felt frozen in place. My back ached from sleeping on the office couch more nights than I wanted to admit. My knees had started aching in ways they never had before. Nobody warns you that when you chase a dream in your late 30s, your ambition stays young while your body quietly begins protesting. I opened the spreadsheet again, hoping somehow the numbers would look different this time. They didn't. Rent, salaries, server costs, legal fees, school fees for Leo. Every line item had teeth. My phone buzzed. For one foolish second, I hoped it might be an investor. Instead, it was a message from Leo's school. He had been picked up late again. "Please see the office in the morning." I closed my eyes and whispered a curse under my breath, quiet enough that only I could hear myself failing. The truth is, the money wasn't even the worst part. It was the small, quiet ways I kept disappointing my son. Our first version of the software had launched 6 months earlier. We proudly called it TrueSight 1, as if giving it a confident name might somehow make it behave confidently. It didn't. During a pilot test at a packaging plant, our sensors misread vibration patterns on a critical machine. The system flagged the failure 3 hours after it had already happened. The plant manager, a blunt but fair man named Otto, stood beside me in a hard hat, watching his production line shut down. He didn't yell. That somehow made it worse. "I like you, Daniel," he said. but I can't pay for software that tells me yesterday's news. I tried explaining that the models simply needed more training data. He raised a hand to stop me. In manufacturing, he said, yesterday is expensive. That sentence haunted me for months. By the end of that week, we lost the contract. By the end of that month, our lead investor told me they were reassessing their exposure, which is simply a polite way of saying they were preparing to abandon ship before it sank completely. 2 employees resigned that same week. One left a printed letter on my desk without a word. The other looked at the floor as he told me his wife was expecting their first child, and he couldn't afford to keep gambling on uncertainty. I understand, I told him. And I meant it. That was the hardest part. I understood everyone's fear except my own. That night, I sold my old truck back home through a friend just to cover payroll one more time. When the transfer finally cleared, I sat on the floor outside Leo's room and cried as quietly as I could, so he wouldn't hear me and worry. The next morning, he found me making toast with red, tired eyes. "Dad, why do your eyes look like that?" "Allergies," I lied. "We don't even have flowers here." "This city has everything, buddy," I said, forcing a smile. He climbed onto a stool and asked for peanut butter, completely unaware of how close everything was to collapsing. I spread it on his toast with one hand while replying to an anxious supplier email with the other. "Are you working late again tonight?" he asked. "Probably," I said, avoiding his eyes. "You said we'd build the model volcano this weekend." "I know. You forgot last time, too." Children rarely sound angry when they say things like that, but somehow, that makes it hurt even more. I put the knife down and looked at him directly. "I'm trying to build something that gives us a better life." He nodded, but he didn't fully understand because how could he? Better life is an adult phrase. Children simply understand who shows up and who doesn't. "I just want you home before I fall asleep," he said. That evening, I left the office at 6 instead of midnight. We built that model volcano on our living room floor while rain tapped against the window outside. I burned our dinner completely, and he laughed so hard he nearly fell off his chair. For 2 hours that night, I wasn't a struggling founder. I wasn't a divorced man trying to prove he hadn't ruined his life. I was simply a father, and it felt like the most important job title I had ever held. That rhythm became our survival pattern. Days for fighting to keep the company alive, evenings for Leo, nights for rebuilding what had broken during the day. I aged faster during that single year than I had in the previous 10 combined. The breakthrough, when it finally came, didn't arrive through some dramatic investor meeting or a corporate miracle. It came from a small, stubborn family business back home called Dawson Metal Works, run by a woman named Nora Dawson, whose father had founded the company decades earlier. Nora agreed to try our system because her maintenance supervisor had heard about us through a mutual contact. On our very first call, she squinted at the screen and asked bluntly, "Aren't you the one who left a director job at Harlow?" "I am," I admitted. "And now you're running a struggling startup overseas?" "Some days it feels that way," I said. She laughed, and that laugh, strangely enough, probably saved my company. Within the first month, our system caught a mechanical failure before it could shut down her production line. By the 3rd month, she called me herself, practically stunned. "You just saved us over 40 hours of downtime," she said. I didn't respond right away. I couldn't. My assistant leaned toward the screen and asked if I was still there. "Yes," I finally said, clearing my throat. "I'm here." "Good," Nora said. "Send me a contract." After the call ended, I sat alone with my hands pressed over my mouth, unable to fully process what had just happened. Then I called Leo immediately. He answered from his after-school program, his face far too close to the camera as usual. "Buddy," I said, my voice cracking slightly, "I think we finally got a real customer." He grinned instantly. "Can we get pizza?" That was Leo. My smallest, most loyal business partner, always focused on the priorities that actually mattered. Word slowly spread. Nora mentioned us to another plant owner, who mentioned us to a consultant, who introduced us to a food packaging company. Nothing happened overnight. Nothing good ever does. But slowly, painfully, Our phone began ringing for reasons other than bad news. By our 5th year, we were finally breaking even. By our 6th, we rehired one of the engineers who had once quit out of fear. By our 7th year, we opened a small North American office, only a short drive from the very building where my old life had ended. I never told Elena. There was simply no reason to. Our communication had shrunk to logistics about Leo's schooling and travel schedule. She remained polite but distant. Some calls she missed entirely. Leo pretended it didn't bother him, but I noticed how often he glanced at the clock during those scheduled video calls that never came. One morning I arrived early at our overseas office and found Leo asleep on the small couch near my desk. He was 11 by then, all elbows and oversized sneakers, visiting during his school break. He had pulled the same worn blanket over himself that he once used to cover me on nights I had fallen asleep at my desk. On the whiteboard behind him, written in blue marker, were 3 simple words: "Dad doesn't quit." I stood there for a long time. Not because everything was suddenly fixed. It wasn't. But because for the first time in years, I felt like maybe I hadn't dragged my son into a disaster after all. Maybe, somehow, I had taught him something worth keeping. Before we continue, let me ask you something honestly. If you had to choose between comfort and your own dream, which one would you choose? Type your answer in the comments. I actually read every single one. And if this story is moving you the way I hope it is, tap that subscribe button now, because the most powerful part is still ahead of us. A week later, early one morning while the office still smelled like fresh coffee, I opened my inbox and saw a name I hadn't seen in years: Gregory Vance, my former boss at Harlow Manufacturing. The subject line read simply, "We need to talk. It's important." I stared at that email for almost a full minute before opening it. Gregory had been the last person to shake my hand the day I resigned. Back then, leaning against his polished desk with his arms crossed, he had told me, "Daniel, I respect your ambition, but predictive maintenance software is a crowded fantasy. You're trading a sure thing for a maybe." A sure thing. I remembered driving home that same day, foolishly believing my wife might still stand beside me despite his warning. By dinner, she had handed me those papers instead. Now, 8 years later, Gregory wanted to talk. His message was short and formal. He mentioned that Harlow was reassessing several strategic priorities and that my name had come up. He would be in town the following month and hoped to meet privately. I read it twice, then set my phone face down on the desk. Across the room, Leo was eating cereal from a paper bowl while finishing homework at our small conference table. He glanced up. "Bad news?" "Not sure yet. That usually means yes." I smiled despite myself. "You're getting far too smart." 3 weeks later, Gregory Vance walked into our modest overseas office wearing a suit that probably cost more than my very first car. He looked older, but carried the same polished confidence, the same practiced smile. "Daniel," he said, extending his hand. "You look well." "You too, Gregory." His eyes swept across our office. Glass walls, engineers working at standing desks, a whiteboard covered in equations. Nothing extravagant, but undeniably alive. "This is impressive," he admitted. "Thank you." "I remember when this was just an idea scribbled in a notebook." "I remember being told the market wasn't ready for it," I replied evenly. His smile faltered slightly. "I may have misjudged that." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was close enough to make the room feel smaller. We sat down. My chief financial officer joined briefly to present our growth numbers, then left us alone. Gregory leaned back and loosened his tie. "Harlow has a problem," he admitted. "That's usually why executives fly halfway across the world personally." He explained that their equipment division was steadily losing clients to competitors who offered integrated monitoring and predictive service, while Harlow was still selling machinery the same way they had 2 decades earlier. "Your platform is better than anything we've managed to build internally," he said. Hearing that should have felt satisfying. Instead, it felt strange, like receiving a compliment from someone who had locked the door behind you and only now noticed you'd climbed through the window on your own. "We'd like to acquire your company," he said, sliding a printed offer across the table. The number at the top was large enough to silence the room for a moment. I thought about every sleepless night, every anxious call from creditors, every school event I had missed, every time Leo had quietly pretended it didn't hurt when his mother forgot to call. That number could have ended all of it instantly. I could have sold everything and never worried about payroll again. "That's a serious offer," I finally said. "You've earned it," Gregory replied. "That's kind of you to say now." His jaw tightened slightly. "I know we misjudged you back then." "No," I said calmly. "You didn't misjudge me. You just didn't want to bet on someone who wasn't already proven." He nodded slowly. "Fair enough. So, what do you want instead?" That question alone told me everything had changed. 8 years earlier, I had sat across from him hoping desperately for his approval. Now he sat across from me, needing my answer. "I'm not selling," I said. "I want a partnership. My company remains independent. Harlow becomes our primary hardware partner across North America. You gain access to a platform your own customers already trust, and I keep what I built." He studied me carefully. "You'd rather stay smaller than take generational wealth?" I thought of Leo asleep on that office couch, that same worn blanket pulled up to his chin. "I already have what matters," I said. "Now I'm simply protecting it." Negotiations dragged on for months. Lawyers across multiple time zones, endless revisions, calls at impossible hours. I stayed mostly out of the spotlight, letting my team handle the details while I focused on running the company and, more importantly, being present for my son. During one late video call, I noticed something that made my pen freeze mid-sentence. Behind Gregory, in his office back home, a woman walked past carrying a white coat over one arm. It was only a few seconds, but I recognized the way she moved instantly. Elena. For a moment, I completely forgot there were 6 other people on that call. My assistant's voice eventually pulled me back. "Daniel, are you still with us?" "Yes," I said. "I'm here." I didn't ask Gregory about it, not that day, not later. But that night, after Leo had gone to sleep, I searched her name out of quiet curiosity. There they were, photos from a charity dinner. Elena in a black dress, standing beside Gregory Vance, both labeled as guests of honor. I leaned back and laughed once under my breath, not because it was funny, but because life had officially become too strange to take seriously anymore. The woman who once refused to risk her future on my dream was now standing beside the very man whose company needed my dream to survive. Weeks later, a formal cream-colored envelope arrived at our office. Inside was an invitation to the Innovation Excellence Summit in Boston, where our company would be honored with an award for technological achievement in manufacturing. I read it twice. My assistant peeked over my shoulder. "That's the big one," she said. "Are you actually going?" Every practical instinct told me to send someone else in my place. But some moments in life aren't about revenge. They're about simply standing where life once tried to break you and letting the truth speak for itself without raising your voice. "Yes," I said. "I'm going." Before we step into that final chapter, if this story has taught you anything about resilience so far, smash that like button right now. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who need to hear it. Now let's finish this story together. 4 weeks later, I walked into a grand ballroom in Boston wearing a simple black suit, carrying my company folder under one arm. Chandeliers cast warm golden light across round tables dressed in white linen. Conversations blended together into a soft, confident hum, the kind reserved for people who had never once doubted where they belonged in a room like this. I had barely taken 10 steps inside when I noticed Gregory near the front of the room. Beside him stood Elena. She turned at the exact moment I did. For one brief second, her expression was completely blank. Then recognition settled in, followed by a small, confident smile, the kind people wear when they already believe they know exactly how a story will end. Just before I reached them, an elderly event staff member near the stage accidentally dropped a stack of presentation folders, sending them sliding across the carpet. Without thinking, I knelt down and began helping him gather them. "Thank you, sir," he said, clearly embarrassed. "No trouble at all," I told him. "I've dropped far worse things than paper." That was the exact moment Elena's voice reached me. "Well," she said, soft and amused. "This is not where I expected to run into you." I looked up. She stood only a few feet away in a deep green dress, her hand resting lightly on Gregory's arm. I stood slowly, my knee protesting slightly, and handed the last folder back to the staff member myself. "Good evening, Elena," I said calmly. Her eyebrows lifted slightly at how composed I sounded. "David," she said, catching herself. "I mean, Daniel." Gregory cleared his throat. "Daniel, I didn't realize you'd be attending tonight personally. It was a long flight," I said simply, "but worth it." Elena glanced at the folders, then at the staff member, then back at me, clearly forming a story in her mind that had nothing to do with reality. "So," she said, lowering her voice as if doing me a kindness, "you're working events now?" For a brief second, my mind drifted back to that kitchen in Denver years earlier, rain against the windows, divorce papers on the table, Leo's toy truck bumping gently against my shoe. The old sting returned, but it didn't arrive as anger this time. It arrived quietly, like an old bruise being pressed just enough to remember it existed. "No," I said evenly. "Just helping someone out." She laughed softly under her breath. "Of course." Gregory shifted uncomfortably beside her. "Elena," he said quietly, almost like a warning. But she was already enjoying herself too much to stop. "I have to admit," she continued, "I didn't think this business of yours would eventually bring you all the way to hotel work." A couple standing nearby glanced over, curious. My face felt warm, not from embarrassment, but from a strange, fleeting urge to defend myself loudly. I wanted to tell her exactly whose name was printed on the award banners hanging around this very room. I wanted to ask if she knew how many nights our son had watched me struggle and still chosen to believe in me anyway. Instead, I simply looked toward the young staff member still standing frozen nearby. "You're all set," I told him gently. "Thank you, sir," he replied quickly. Elena heard the word "sir" and completely misunderstood its meaning. Her smile widened. "I always knew you'd end up serving people eventually." There it was, the line she had probably been saving without even realizing it for years. Gregory's mouth tightened, but he said nothing. That silence told me everything I needed to know about where his loyalty currently stood. For years, I had quietly wondered whether I would feel satisfaction if life ever handed me a moment exactly like this one. A perfect opportunity to make her regret every single word she had once said to me. But standing there with jet lag pressing heavily behind my eyes, I mostly just felt tired. Tired of being judged by people who only understood safety. Tired of being measured against an old version of myself that no longer existed. "I hope you're doing well," I said quietly. That response seemed to bother her far more than any sharp reply ever could have. "I am," she said, tightening her grip on Gregory's arm. "Very well, actually." "I'm glad," I said, and I genuinely meant it. Before anyone could say another word, the event host's voice rose clearly over the sound system, announcing the beginning of the award ceremony. Guests slowly began making their way toward their assigned tables. Elena's confident expression flickered slightly, as if some small part of her sensed that the story she believed she understood wasn't quite finished yet. A few minutes later, the host stepped onto the stage and introduced the recipient of the Innovation Excellence Award for Outstanding Contribution to Industrial Technology. My company's name echoed clearly across the room. Applause rose instantly, warm and genuine, filling every corner of that ballroom. I walked toward the stage slowly, my folder tucked under my arm, passing directly by the table where Elena and Gregory now sat frozen in stunned silence. I didn't look at them. I didn't need to. For the first time in 8 years, their opinion of me simply didn't matter anymore. Standing at that podium, looking out across a room full of executives and industry leaders, I thought not about revenge, not about proving anyone wrong, but about a small boy asleep on an office couch with a worn blanket pulled up to his chin and 3 simple words written on a whiteboard behind him. "Dad doesn't quit." I thought about every sacrifice, every quiet fear, every night I nearly gave up but chose one more day instead. I thought about how failure and success often look identical while you're living through them, and how only time reveals which one you're actually building. Later that night, back in my hotel room, I called Leo. He was older now, taller, sharper, already asking questions about business the way most kids ask about video games. "How did it go?" he asked. "We won," I told him. "I knew you would," he said simply, without a hint of surprise, as if he had never once doubted it. That single sentence meant more to me than any award or any acquisition offer ever could. Because in the end, this story was never really about proving Elena wrong, or Gregory wrong, or anyone else who had once written me off as finished before I even began. It was about a father who refused to let one painful afternoon in a small kitchen define the rest of his life. It was about a son who grew up watching failure and persistence sit side by side at the same dinner table and learned that they don't cancel each other out. They build each other. Sometimes the people who doubt us the loudest end up teaching us exactly how badly we need to prove them wrong, not through anger, but through quiet, steady work that eventually speaks for itself. And sometimes, the very people who once told us we would fail are the ones standing in the room when we finally prove that failure was never the only possible ending. If this story moved you even slightly, share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to bet on yourself. Leave a comment telling me which part hit you the hardest. And if you want more stories exactly like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because the next story might just be the one that changes how you see your own life.